Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear me, Carlos?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. So, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Good evening. Welcome to the Adinas working group. This is the first meeting that we're having as a working group. So, very happy to be here with you. Next slide, please. So, the usual etiquette for the virtual meeting. Please join the queue before participating and mute your mic unless you are speaking. Ideally, turn off your video unless you are speaking as well. If you have any questions or doubts about how to use Mitico, you can use those links. Next slide, please. The usual not well. So this is an official IETF meeting. So by participating, you agree to follow the IETF process policies. If you are aware of any patent or patent application that is owned or controlled, you must disclose it to the IETF or the chairs. You acknowledge that the information that is going to be shared here, written, audio, video, is going to be made public. And all the information that you provide to the IETF will be handled in accordance with the IETF privacy statement. Very importantly, as a participant, you agree to work respectfully with other participants. And if you have any issues or feel harassed, please contact the ombudsman. Next slide, please. A note on that, a brief reminder from the IETF guidelines of conduct. So IETF participants extend respect and courtesy to their colleagues at all times. So please be mindful of this whenever you participate or provide any technical criticism. We have all impersonal discussions, so we talk about technology and not about personal issues. We all have the goal to devise solutions for the global internet. So we have to keep that in mind, that we all have a common goal, and make sure that you are prepared to contribute on the ongoing work of the group. So make sure you read and understand the drafts and the presentations before the meeting starts so that we make it more efficient. Next slide, please. So the minutes are taken. The meeting is recorded and it will be streamed afterwards. So your presence is logged by logging into Data Tracker. And we ask the scribes to please contribute online minutes to the Code EMD. We have right now you that had agreed to help us with the minutes. Are you connected? I don't see you yet in the call. So do we have anyone that can start taking minutes while you connect? Can anyone help us with the minutes? This is important. Amelia?
I'll help you minutes. It's Rob Wilton here.
We all have audio. Juan Carlos, I think you are muted. We lost your audio. Thanks, Robert, for taking the minutes.
Thank you. I clicked on the mic by mistake when switching screens. So thank you very much, Bob. And yes, you will also help with the minutes, hopefully, when he is able to join, but the more the merrier. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda that we have for today. We're going to spend a few minutes, just because this is the first meeting as a working group, to remind you about the status, where we are, what are our objectives. Then we're going to move to the status update from other SEOs, starting from the WBA, moving on to 802.1, 802.11, Then we're going to start talking about the two drafts that we have at hand. The first one being the randomized and changing MAC addresses use cases by Jerome. And then the MAC address randomization, Amelia will present. And then we're going to talk about next steps. Any questions or comments on the agenda? Okay, hearing none, we can move to the next slide, please. So as a reminder, we so far have been meeting as a BOF, and the purpose of the BOF was set to inform the IETF community about the latest MAC address randomization activities and purposes. We presented also the network and application service-related issues that were related to this MAC address randomization. And the idea was to identify whether any actions were required at the IETF. And we identified at least these three, which is the coordination with other SDOs, documentation of use cases, and identification of existing solutions and gaps. And therefore, we got charter. Next slide, please. So knowing that the MAC address randomization is here and now, and that for some network services, the device identity is important, we want to understand and see how to still provide those services without necessarily endangering the privacy features that were addressed by the MAC address randomization. So the idea here is mainly to explore the fact that so far many applications make an implicit assumption that the device uses an IEEE 2 layer 2 identification, also known as MAC address, that is permanent and unique, and this is no longer the case. So we will then work on identifying these scenarios and see what is the effect of RCM on them. Then we will also analyze identifiers that can be used beyond the MAC address for network to provide the seamless service, and also the scenarios where the identity is actually not required, that maybe we're misusing the MAC address. Next slide, please. We are chartered to work on a BCP that will recommend means to reduce the impact of RCM on use cases, while of course still ensuring the privacy achieved with RCM is not compromised. And also we are chartered to work together with other IETF working groups. We have identified many like DHC or Interia, as well as liaise with other SDOs. And also we have identified IEEE 2, the Wireless Broadband Alliance, WBA, and we have already started some discussions with them that will be reported right after this. So as far as deliverables, we have the documents about the current status or current state of affairs, an informational use case and identity requirements document, and an informational MAC address randomization current state of affairs document. And we have two drafts that try to respond to those. So we'll talk about them, and the idea is to adopt them by the working group. And also we have we'll be working later on a BCP. So I think that's it. Next slide. Yes. So we can move next on the agenda to Tim.
Tim, do you want to share the screen, or we put the slides and then you let us know how to drive?
If you can share the slides for me, that would help. I'm on a very slow link here.
Sure, I'll do that.
Is my audio okay this time?
Yes, it's good.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. So, just as an overview, we have in the WBA a Wi-Fi devices identification project that we set up back in January to look at this issue of randomized and changing MAC addresses, and what the effects of this were and what we could do about it insofar as it affects various services that WBA members may be providing. Could I have the first slide, please? So the objectives are, as stated here, to look at the MAC address and find alternatives to identify typically users, but sometimes devices, and indeed look at whether identification is actually necessary in some cases. The next objective, analyze and look at the currently available solutions. That's because we're a high-level organization, that's largely what we've been doing. Then, of course, liaise with other standards organizations such as yourselves. And then at the end of it all, explain and recommend technologies that ideally are already present, so that people who are using MAC addresses at the moment can move on to something more appropriate. So next slide, please. So we've looked at a number of use cases for where the MAC address is currently or has been used as a long-term identifier, and where this is going to cause issues with the service. And we've previously liaised a document with you covering those. Following on from that, we've gone through those use cases and looked at the various requirements that they present in terms of, the uniqueness of the identity, its scope and duration. Now, typically, although MACs are being used, the uniqueness is really for the user within a particular network. And the duration very often is long-term. These are people who've signed up for a service, and it's about identifying the user of a service. We've also spent quite some time discussing the issues of privacy and consent for identification, and what happens if the user doesn't want to consent to use some alternative form of identification. So having looked at all those requirements, and really the requirements cover everything from we just want to identify a device for a session, right through to we want to identify a person and each of their devices for potentially years. So there's not really anything ruled out. So having looked at those requirements, we've moved on to examining the obvious existing solutions. Clearly starting with the 802.1x based authentications, WPA2 or 3 Enterprise, Passpoint, and over the top of that, open roaming. We've also looked at the private pre-shared key, device fingerprinting, and other proprietary external identification, such as where an app or a website is used to identify the user, and that's then communicated back to the Wi-Fi network to either allow access to certain resources, or maybe to set up perhaps something like a particular QoS level. And of course, the other alternative, which is doing nothing. There will be some situations in which not doing anything and just leaving the MAC to change is a perfectly viable option. And we wanted to understand what the effects of that would be. Because of a lack of time and expertise, we haven't really looked at Wi-Fi Easy Connect or 802.1 AR, which we don't understand but looked interesting. As a result of examining these solutions, there are some things that they don't really provide They don't really provide the functionality that we previously had available from an unchanging Mac. And we're currently discussing what the implications of that are. Next slide, please. So the idea is that having looked at all these solutions and what they can offer, that we will want to make recommendations for each type of network. So in this case, a type of network will be things like hospitality or in-home or enterprise, or public networks that are either paid or free. So those are the network types that we're talking about here. And we've in the process at the moment of looking at each of those currently available solutions and suggesting which of them might be preferable for which network type. Alongside that, we find that obviously not everything that we used to do with Mac is covered. The main things we find, I think, are Wi-Fi network diagnostics, such as is used for the home or enterprise, where devices are unable to connect, and not that they simply can't associate, but maybe they're not even attempting to connect. We have no means of identifying that device belongs to the network and perhaps should have been attempting. But equally, we don't want to be collecting information about devices that have no relationship with the network and shouldn't be connecting anyway. And it's very hard to distinguish those two. And without the Mac, currently, we don't have a solution for that. There are also issues where, because the Mac is based on, or the randomized Mac is peculiar to an SSID, we may have a service provider with multiple SSIDs. And the example here, there's one for the hotel and one for the conference rooms. So a delegate at the conference staying in the hotel may have to deal with two different SSIDs, and their device will appear from the point of view of the Mac to be two different devices. So that issue needs to be considered. There's also the issues of lawful intercept and obtaining ICRs. Sorry, that's internet connection records. The law enforcement may come to an operator and say, we need the connection records. And currently, they may use a MAC address to specify the device that they want to do that for. Obviously, that's going to be completely unviable. But the legal obligation to provide those records is still going to remain. So those are just a brief outline as far as we've got at the moment of some of the things that we don't feel are covered. And the next step, it follows on from item 5 here, is to So we're going to make recommendations about the solutions, and the way we've written it at the moment is looking at the solutions and what they can do. We're now in the process of looking at the network types and assigning the solutions to them. All of this is going to be bundled up into our white paper, which is supposed to be completed by the end of this year and will be published at the end of the process. So I won't bother. The next slide is just a thank you all very much for listening. So that's it from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Are there any questions for Tim? Steven?
If the WBA has come up with any proposed solutions, it sounds like the MAC address is still the best way. Have you thought of using UUID and the IE information or something like that?
Certainly we're not considering that the MAC address is the best way. Most of the solutions at the moment for larger, more public networks, hospitality, enterprise, we're suggesting that one of the 802.1x based methods is the way to go. For home networks, there may be some applicability for PPSK or even device fingerprinting, but neither of those are standards, and we don't really like recommending non-standardized solutions.
Okay.
As regards the other items, yeah, there are things we haven't covered, and that's mostly because we don't have the knowledge at the moment to cover them.
So will this white paper be available to the public or shared with the IETF at least?
Typically, the executive summary is made public, and the white paper itself is available to members and liaisons. So it could well be shared with the IETF, but we will have to discuss the implications of that if the IETF were to be making it public.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, so I hope in the queue. Thanks, Tim, for that question. And indeed, as you can see, there's quite a bit of overlap on the use cases identification, but this is rather a good thing, seeing that WBA has taken a good quick start at the issue. So the point is here not to reinvent the wheel, but rather to work together to make sure that we consider the use cases that have already been identified by WBA. We can extend them, of course, in Adinas to other use cases that may not be interesting for WBA. And also, of course, regarding the solutions, we are going to talk to IEEE 802 or other IETF groups to make sure that the solutions are also considered. So yes, the idea is to work together with WBA, and as Tim mentioned, we have the means to also work with the liaisons to make it official if ever we need to get access to some documents, or we can reference them and put information in our draft or something like that. But for sure, we want to share information and make sure that we work together with them.
Yeah, super. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. So next in line is Glenn. And if you want to share preloaded slides, Glenn, that's the preferred way.
Do you want me to share the slides, or can you do that? What's the?
If you click on the icon that is right next to the hand on top. It says share preloaded slides. You should see your slides there, and then you can control the presentation.
Share preloaded under meeting materials. Is that where it is?
No. Below your name.
Below my name.
On the left top, you have a hand to join the queue, and then next icon.
Yeah, I only see ask to share screen, ask to share slides, and join queue.
Ask to share slides, and then you will see the list of slides that are being preloaded.
Ask to share slides. Oh, okay. Ask to share slides, and then oh, I see. So then the 802.1 update. Is that
great? You're on.
Okay. Is that? Can you see the slides? I'm not so familiar with this setup.
Yes, we see it in
advanced
high resolution.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so thank you very much for giving me the time to present here. My name is Glenn Parsons. I'm affiliated with Ericsson, and I'm also the chair of the 802.1 working group within IEEE. But as the chair, because I'm the chair, I have to give this disclaimer that this is a personal presentation and is not a formal presentation of IEEE or the 802.1 working group because they have not approved this presentation. But be that as it may, this is my view of the situation in 802.1. And just to give you a quick background of what 802.1 is within IEEE, we're the architecture and bridging working group, traditionally called the higher layer interface. We've been around since the beginning of the 802 Standards Committee, and we are part of the Landman Standards Committee along with .11, .3, .15, and so on. We operate at what we call the higher layer of the data link layer here, which is effectively the higher layer of the MAC, and that's the protocols that we deal with. This is the organization on the right of the 802.1 working group. Most of our work right now is focused on time-sensitive networking. However, we do have work on security, which I'll mention, and we do have architecture work that has happened in the past and will start up again. And we currently have a study project underway in our industry connections activity, NENDICA. So just, I guess, a brief background, if you will, on the reference model. And this is a reference model that is defined within IEEE standard 802, which is our base overview and architecture standard. And this defines the interfaces between the different layers with the terminology of access points. And so you see physical access points and MAC access points and so on. And the MAC address is defined at the MAC address point and is common to all 802 technologies. So the MAC address, as I'm sure you know, is 48 or 64-bit number used to identify the source and destination, and may also be used, as I said, as this MAC SAP that I showed in the previous figure. There are a number of bits at the beginning of the MAC address. The individual group address identifies whether it's an individual address, which is the typical case, or a group address, which is like a broadcast address. And then the universal and local bit identifies whether it's universally administered, which means the IEEE registration authority assigns that number, or whether it is locally administered. And locally, locally was originally not so defined, but was recently defined, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You can see that the way that the address is structured is that a subset of the address is assigned. So this is for the universal addresses. A subset of that address is assigned by the registration authority, the IEEE registration authority, that currently assigns addresses in either large, medium, or small, depending on how many universal addresses that that are desired for the use case. So whether it's 4,000 or so, or up to 16 million per block. So as I had mentioned, there is some organization that has been added in Standard 802, and this was in discussions that that we had with the registration authority, that they're concerned that there was an impending exhaustion of the MAC address space, mostly due to virtualization. And the view that going forward, MAC addresses would no longer be just for physical devices, as was the original intent, but there would be many virtual devices, so that a single physical device could have numerous virtual instances of whether of end stations or bridges or other devices within them that would require MAC addresses. And this would lead to exhaustion if the universal space was used. And so what was done was a more structured use of the local space was defined. And so the local space was previously just whether the local bit was set, which is shown here as the X bit. And what was done was that two additional bits were identified, Y and Z here, which are the next ones in, to identify an optional structured local address plan. And there are 4 different regions of the local space that this plan has identified. The first one is an extended local space, and this is using an additional identifier that the registration authority has offered. And so this specifically was intended for those virtual environments. And then there is a standard assigned. And so a standard could assign reusable addresses, for example, in a particular range within the standard assigned space. Administratively assigned is intended so that this is where an administration would assign its addresses. And the intent here was that any randomization would be within this administratively assigned space. And then there's reserved, and this was reserved for future specification of the local space. So just back again on the registration authority committee and identifying the registries. And so this is the registry that IEEE maintains. Indicates that Standard 802 is the standard definition for what a MAC address is, number one, and for what the different assignments that are given. Here you see with the MAL, MAM, and MAS, and showing here, this is a 48-bit address, and then the different local extensions that a particular vendor or manufacturer who acquires the MAL, they would then have 24 bits to assign and assign it to 16 million odd different devices. And so in addition to the MAC address, there are other identifiers that are also defined in Standard 802, including the company ID, OIDs, URNs, and so forth. So what results here in the unicast space? So this is not the group addresses, which is the first bit, but in the unicast space we have the global space, which is effectively the OUI plus an extension, and so the OUI was the original term for MAL, and so that's the global space. And then you see the other 4 quadrants that I had just mentioned, which have which this is an organization, an optional organization of the local space to help the administrators assign addresses in that space. One of the activities that we have underway as well in 802.1 is a protocol that would allow administrators to actually assign MAC addresses to devices on boot up, and so that's another activity we currently have underway. But one of the things that is recognized in Standard 802 that's indicated here is that there is a presumed guarantee of uniqueness within 802 networks, and that's uniqueness of the MAC address. And so this is facilitated with the global addresses and the universal space. However, if the local space is used, it's the administrators of that network responsibility to ensure uniqueness. And if there is not unique addresses, there is a potential of disruption of the network because of that. And so, and as I had mentioned before, the randomization was intended for the administratively assigned space. One thing I'd like to note is that we have currently a study underway within our industry connections activities on an evolved linked layer architecture. This is a precursor to the revision of Standard 802. One of the requirements within IEEE is that standards must be revised every 10 years to remain active. And so the current Standard 802, I guess, expires in this 10 years at the end of 2024. And so we'll be starting a revision of that early next year, most likely, to finish before the end of 2024. One of the topics within the discussion is on MAC addresses and the specific mapping of single or multiple MAC addresses to MSAPs from an architecture perspective. So that may be interesting to this group going forward. So that's the MAC address status. Just to give you an update now on some of the security aspects that we're working on here. I just gave a background on MACsec, which is security and privacy. As was noted in the previous presentation, we also have standards on port authentication, which is .1x, and Secure ID, which is .1AR. These have finished some time ago and are both widely used. But I can provide a further update on those at a future time if that's desired. But I wanted to highlight on the MACsec because we have a project underway on this, and privacy itself is relevant for this discussion because what we had done in 802 in this standalone 802E document is specify a threat model for all 802 technologies against privacy. And the point is what are the threats and how can they be mitigated? How can we protect against them? And so this is intended as a consistent approach for all 802 developers, and so it's a worthwhile background information on the threat model. So on MACsec itself, that is intended as encryption, so data protection. And of course, counters to some man-in-the-middle attacks that had been identified some time ago. But the point is that with the new project that we currently have underway, which is MAC privacy protection, this is specifying enhancements to MAC security that reduces the ability for observers to correlate information, infer information about a particular stream based on the size and the user's identity. And so the way that it does that is that it encapsulates the entire frame, including the MAC addresses, and pads the data out. And so that, for example, you would have a consistent, steady stream of traffic from the user to an endpoint, no matter what's being transmitted. So that's an activity that's currently underway. And just as an example, this is a diagram of what that user frame encapsulation would be in this MACsec privacy frame, where you see that it's first encoded, encoding the whole frame and adding a special one-time new MAC address to the front, and then so that's the privacy step, and then encrypting the whole thing. And so this allows both a confidentiality and a protection, hiding the user's MAC address, as well as the original frame sizes, from everyone from where this is encrypted to the endpoint where it's decrypted. And so and the reason that this was done is that there's actually solutions to do this already, but it was we had some input that standard-based, common, interoperable approach to this was desired. And so we're about halfway through this project and expecting to go to the final ballot on this early next year. So that's all that I had to summarize. Happy to take some questions. And this is a summary of some additional information if you want to find out about the .1 working group and the work underway in either NENDICA that I mentioned or the security group. The 802.1 standards are freely available through the GET program on Explore, so you can just link to them here. And then there are some tutorials, some additional technical tutorials, whether it's on TSN or the local MAC address concept or 802.1 bridging itself. And then I have a link from the RAC tutorial on this as well. So thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Are there any questions for Glenn? Michael?
This is really great. That's really great. One of the things that I observe as we move to people using randomized addresses is, of course, is that they no longer, in many cases, need any IEEE assigned space. So that seems to be happening on the one hand for a lot of consumer type devices. A group that I'm involved with in the IoT Security Foundation, actually we would like to go the other way. We would like for industrial uses, we'd really like to have more clear identities for IoT devices. And specifically, what we're wondering is, would the IEEE ever consider going to a situation where they would issue CIDR-like certificates saying that this manufacturer owns this particular address space, and that would allow them to issue certificates with MAC addresses in them as the mostly industrial IoT device identity. So it's sort of the other direction to more strong identities for certain situations rather than the weaker ones we have.
So I think what you're talking about is what we have in .1 AR, which is our secure device identity. And so that is a mechanism that defines how authentication credentials, dev IDs is what we call them, and how they're cryptographically bound to devices to support this identity.
Right.
So that's what we do have. Is that what you were?
Well, we would be using 1ARs. The problem is, what is the identity that's being asserted? Because the only thing we can see over the network is the MAC address. And so we would really like it if there was a trust path up to the IEEE that allowed us to validate that a particular OUI was assigned to a particular vendor, and that vendor had issued a certificate. And this is kind of the opposite of randomized MAC address. But what we observe is that for certain things, we really want to go away from user-specific identifiable things. But if for other devices, we actually want to go the other direction. We want a stronger connection to the device identity rather than weaker.
Right. Okay. So you're looking specifically at MAC addresses, and you're looking for the trust model to an administrator or IEEE, because .1 AR is kind of the user to the manufacturer. So that's
right. Exactly.
Right.
We want user to through IEEE to manufacturer kind of stuff.
Right. So what we're working on, which I didn't highlight here, a protocol called .1CQ, is MAC address assignment, and that is one of the options within that is a trust relationship on that assignment. But this is it's not, I guess it's not decided yet whether IEEE would be one of the trusted assigners. The original intention would be that that would be an administration, and so that within an administration, I mean, if you're talking industrial networks, it could be like a factory, I suppose, and that within that factory, there would be a trusted assignment of MAC addresses.
Yeah, they're not competent to do that, and they don't have the ability to install the certificate before the device is onboarded. But part of this is also to provide some anchor for all of the nice security and the privacy enhancements that you did provide, and so that they all would look the same at a layer 2. We would do all our layer 2 security, and we would hide the real identities in some cases, but without a strong anchor, well, we can't do that security randomly, right?
Right. Well, so I mean that is a good point. I mean, which pushes for that done on a higher level, and I can take that back to the group and see if that's an ecosystem that is that we'd like to encourage to be created within IEEE. I mean, that would be a registration authority piece, but we can look at that, because I mean, what we had been focusing on has been the protocols, which I've been talking about, like with AR and CQ and such.
Great. So thank you very much, Glenn.
Okay, thank you.
We need to move on to the next presenter now. That was very, very good. Next in line is Jerome. Hi, Jerome.
All right, good morning. Let me try to
should be able to
share the slides. All right. So thank you, everyone. Let me try to send my video, and if it crashes, I'll I'll stop. All right. So thank you, Glenn, for this presentation, and following on his lead, I should say that this is also a personal view as a active participant in these two groups, not an official liaison or anything like that. So what I wanted to do here is to give you, with Juan Carlos, a quick update on what's going on in the 802.11 that some people call Wi-Fi, right? But it's not what 802.11 calls itself, in that context of RCM and this group. So we started in that environment to observe, that devices, as we discussed at the beginning, change the MAC address, and they tend to rotate the MAC address before connecting to an access point. And also they more and more use randomized MAC addresses when they connect to an access point with more or less stability. So that idea has been present along with the idea of privacy for a while. And in the year 2018, that practice of randomized MAC address has been observed and studied a little bit in the context of a document called 802.11aq, which is, like many of the other amendments, improvements to the standard that are made every now and then integrated later in the standard. And what 802.11aq says is that you can use this randomized MAC address. There is no obligation to use the burned-in MAC address in your device if you're not associated. But if you are associated, and what we call you maintain a state with an access point, you cannot change your MAC address within that context, because you would be breaking your state. So you break the state and then you restart. So that was one thing that was looking at RCM, but at the same time, this idea of privacy in 802.11 and RCM was becoming a more important issue that drove the creation of two groups. First, a topic interest group, and then a study group. It's the normal progression in the 802.11 world, where a group of people are interested in a new topic that may become some work. And that was in 2019 and 2020. And then in the end, the outcome of that study group was the creation of two subgroups, task groups in 802.11, 802.11bh and 802.11bi. So what BH does is to look at enhanced services with randomized MAC addresses. If I want to paraphrase what the idea is about, is to say RCM is happening in 802.11. What do we need to do to maintain services in that context? Are there things that are going to break if devices change the MAC address? And of course, the answer may be no in most cases, but there may be some cases where yes, some services that were possible before MAC addresses were randomized and rotating will not be possible anymore. So the goal of 802.11 BH is to come through, the use cases where we think that maybe services might be broken in the 802.11 sense by this rotation of MAC addresses, and you'll see if we can, provide some recommendation on how to fix that. It's intended to be a short-term quote group. The expectation is that by 2023-ish, which is pretty fast in these standard groups, they should come with some text, for remediation of whatever might be broken, of course, and pushing aside and listing what we think is not broken. As we speak, we spend quite some time looking at the use cases that we should be tackling. What is really broken by RCM? I know in many cases we find that some services are not in 802.11. You do additional stuff on top, and you just write on the fact that you had the MAC address, so you use that stuff to identify a device. But that's nothing to do with 802.11. So there are plenty of cases that came up initially as potential candidates that we simply pushed aside, say, well, that is not an 802.11 function. You just happen to take the opportunity of using the MAC to identify a machine, or even worse, a user, and you think the MAC is a good way of doing that, and it's not. So plenty of things are left aside. And this is, I think, important for us in Adinas, because in particular, anything which is above 802.11 on the MAC layer is not necessarily something that 802.11 needs to solve. We're not dealing with DHCP, DNS, whatever. So that is something I think important for our group here to keep following. So we have a good view now on what use cases are probably broken, and you see them at the top. Most of the time, they're about things where you did establish a state, and for which that state has consequence in terms of service, even if they are only related to 802.11 and not directly related to 802.11. For example, IT support and troubleshooting. You place a call, and then the service breaks at some level. You call IT support and say, well, phone was not working yesterday, and they ask you, okay, what's your machine IP? Well, I don't know, it was yesterday. What's your MAC address? I don't know, it was yesterday, it changed. So that kind of service is not directly 802.11, but we do see why 802.11 is involved in that idea of saying, well, if you have a Wi-Fi service that breaks or 802.11 service that breaks, then it may be related to the fact that you cannot identify the station anymore in the context of 802.11 that this service breaks. But many others are not involved there. And there's this other group, which is 802.11 BI. So BH again is surviving 802.11 with RCM. Is anything breaking? 802.11 BI is more around enhanced service with data privacy protection. So the idea is to say Wi-Fi, 802.11, any of these radio technologies has this characteristic that if you're in range of the signal, you may be able to observe what's going on. Whereas, as we were discussing in the chat before, if you're on a wire cable to a switch, you may be able to read what's going on in the cable from the electromagnetic field at very short range, but really, you'll see it only if you are on the wire or if you are in the switch. In 802.11, if you're in range of the signal, you may read stuff. And of course, the question says, the question comes and say, well, does that, have any impact on privacy? So it's a common question that comes is, what is the relationship between BH and BI? So BI is not necessarily looking at RCM itself, although RCM being the reason because of privacy concerns that it happened. There is kind of a relationship that we keep playing along in these two groups, and of course sometimes the ball bounces from one group to the other because it's more the field of one or the other. But the goal of BI is to say, what should we improve in 802.11 if there are some things in 802.11 that have impact on privacy? So can we list those? Is there something we can do about it? So the goal of BI, of course, as you can can see, is deeper than BH, and therefore its work stream is intended to be longer. We expect some publication by 2025, 2 years more than the 8.11 BH. So at this stage in the BI group, what we're trying to do is to list the privacy-related issues with 8.11. And as you can guess, there are plenty. First, there are some elements that we reuse from one association to the other. If we want to reassociate and come back to an access point to expedite the process, there are plenty of things that we can re-say to be recognized by the infrastructure. And of course, this could be indications. There are tons of things in the frame at the MAC layer, as Glenn was describing it, but even at lower layer that we tend to use, which are mechanical, that may be usable to identify a particular station in the crowd. So all these things are things that we are trying to list as we go along. At the same time, because the problem is not entirely new, there has been quite some thoughts already on some privacy issues in 8.2.11. So we see also some proposal coming up in the group about, fixing some points issues that have been known or identified for a while. So, these proposals are, put aside, of course, listed and carefully kept, so that once we have the complete list of use cases, we can see if those proposals have solved, some of these use cases, what is missing, and merge everything together. So the goal is that by March 2022-ish, we should have a good idea of what the use cases are, what is broken in terms of, or what is at risk in terms of privacy in 8.11. From there, try to get some requirement and some proposal to try to work on. So, I think in the term of Adinas, both of these groups are probably very interesting for us to keep a liaison with. BI, because privacy is the source of the cause of RCM, it seems, in the first place. So that's something we probably want to keep an eye on. And BH, because it's clear that things that BH will fix will probably have an influence on what the Adinas recommendations may be, because maybe they'll decide to have a stable representation for the MAC address when applicable under the control of the user, all that stuff. In that case, there may be some resolution of issues that we may be identifying in Adinas, but in some other cases they may say, oh, this is not our problem, and they may throw that things on our laps, and we may need to be aware of that to say, well, maybe then we need to tackle that here in the IETF. All right, let me pause here and see if we have any questions or feedback on these two groups.
Are there any questions for Jerome on 8.2.11 BI or BH? Stephen?
Yeah, I noticed that what the WBA is working on is very similar to the BH. So I'm assuming you guys are closely collaborating on a general recommendation for this work group.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. That's an excellent point. So 8.2.11 BH, 8.2.11 in general is definitely talking a lot with WBA. So I would say the goals are probably not the same, in that in 8.2.11 BH, what we're looking at is the mechanics of 8.2.11. Do you break anything if you change the MAC, within a connection? WBA, because it's the Wireless Broadband Alliance, and I don't want to speak for Tim, is looking more about the effect of RCM on what they're trying to achieve with their members. So there's definitely, interactions and liaisons, because we're looking at the same problem, and they also talk a lot with the Wi-Fi Alliance, where there are some security groups and some other groups, impacted by RCM as well. But I would say that although we look at the same issues, our angle is probably slightly different. But yes, we talk a lot. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Bob, do you want? You're in the queue. You want to say something? Bob Moskowitz? Okay. Well, we've fixed the.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
that should work. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Hey, Bob.
Okay. my work in unmanned aircraft has the exact opposite problem, and that is that the identity must be known because you're in a public space, the airspace. And the design is to use the MAC address to be able to associate the message stream from the unmanned aircraft by the observer. So requires two things. One, that for what we technically call an operation, or generally called a flight, must use the same MAC address for that time. But actually the problem is on the other side. The receiver application has to get the MAC address to be able to associate the messages together to be able to say what is that unmanned aircraft doing and what messages are it saving. And we've been finding that on many of the smartphones, the API does not send the MAC address up the stack. So we're using Wi-Fi beacons. I'm using the vendor IE, what's that, 221, I believe, Glenn, and with a specific vendor that's been I think it was Parrot is using their vendor ID that they got. And so they would associate these together to make a stream, but then the API puts a pseudo MAC address up to the application, which then breaks the whole intent to be able to link the messages together. So here's a case where the MAC address is needed in a broadcast media to be able to link messages in an environment where privacy is basically not allowed up to some level of definition of privacy. So it's a slightly different use case, just bringing it here to point it out. And you can see it in my draft IETF grip grid under the privacy section I talk about.
Okay, I'll look it up because it's an interesting case, and you were right on the client side. On the access point, of course, it's different, but on the client side, there's been a lot of efforts to try to hide the MAC address to avoid precisely that. Applications would extract the MAC without the user consent and just send it out for in tracking of the user. So you're describing that scenario where we are in a point where we say, well, it's important that the user has control, but also there are many scenarios where the user doesn't know that this is a problem, that there would need to be asked a question. But then there is of course this difficult question: how many times do you ask a user about what, and do they understand the question? So that's one of the things where 11BH is looking into. Is there anything that breaks? But we're looking at the 802.11 side. What you seem to be looking at is more in the application side of 802.11. So I'm not sure which forum would be best to examine this. But I definitely will look at a document you're talking about.
We also have a problem with the GPS information on the smartphones, and that's an FCC issue, which doesn't come here. That we have to know where the device is, the receiver is, and but that's for another conversation, not this one here.
That's likely difficult too.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Jerome, for that answer. Amelia?
Yes, hello. Thank you for this presentation, Jerome. Am I audible correctly?
Yes, you are.
Okay, very good. Well, so a lot of the, in many of the updates that we've heard from the standards development organizations in this section, the problems identified are, or the use cases and challenges, both in terms of identification and privacy protection, are overlapping. And so maybe this is a broader question than just for Jerome, but how do we envisage moving ahead with identifying the correct technical circumstances in which to address which problem? So do we have something like a foreseen way of saying, for instance, in the IEEE 802.11 TGBI working group, that, well, this is a problem that is not suitable to be solved here, but maybe we should be solving it in the IETF. And similarly, if we identify here in Adinas a problem, is there a way that we could pass that either down to .11 or up to WBA, etc.?
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And of course, you're in all these groups, so I know you know the answer, but thank you for allowing me to share our thoughts. Yeah, I think it's something which is critical for us here and to continue doing, the liaison with BH, BI, and probably WBA and WFA. Because in BH, for example, we spend a lot of time looking at use cases and asking, is that something that breaks with RCM? Is it something that breaks and we care about? And in many cases, the answer is yes, it breaks with RCM, but we don't care. So it's important that as each group lists the possible issues, we keep sending those exchanges back and forth. And I'm sure that at some point we'll say, well, we don't think it's any one of us to solve. You've been using the MAC address wrong. Stop using that. But in some cases, yeah, my expectation is that we'll be pushing ball from one side to the other. I think liaison between these groups, and of course, many participants of one group are also participants of the others. So I think this is critical. If we don't do that, if we work in isolation, we'll fail.
Great. Thanks a lot for that answer, Jerome. So let's move on then to the next item. After seeing the updates from SDOs, now it's time to talk about the drafts that we have proposed for the group. And we'll start with Jerome.
Oh, okay, again. I don't want to take the mic for everybody, but okay. Let me share the next slide. All right. Okay, so this is something that hopefully most of you are aware of. We've been working on this draft for a little while. And so what we're trying to do here is, in the context of Adinas, we know that RCM, the fact that you change the MAC address that is used to identify a station, is going to affect services. And if it affects services for the station, it may affect the user experience of that station. So we try to understand what context this deals with and what is the requirement for that kind of issue. However, we also found that a very common problem we face when we encounter those conversations is vocabulary. And I've seen in the chats a typical example of that, where we use terms in different contexts, and of course it becomes very difficult very soon to understand each other. If you say that they should not read my MAC address, they who who is they? If we're not specific into what we're defining, then it becomes very difficult to make progress because we keep redefining terms all the time and each person has a different term. So what this draft does first is try to say, can we define a little bit better, the environment where we operate, so we can refer to the same, kind of structure environment when we talk about problems and solutions. In particular, we reuse what Glenn was describing, which is the 802E, and others group that use the terminology of personal versus managed devices. Personal device is something which a device which traffic is directly relatable to a single user. If you have your smartphone, most of the time only you use your smartphone. So whatever traffic comes from that smartphone is likely being associated to you directly. And personally, shared service devices and what we call managed devices are devices which traffic is not necessarily directly associated to a person. Typical example we take, at the infrastructure level is a switch or an access point in an airport. That at some point you may see someone's traffic there, but if you look over time at the traffic of that access point or switch, you cannot really link it directly to one single person. Also, on the endpoint standpoint, if you have a barcode scanner or tablet in a factory where you enter things about the production, the person that enters the stuff on the information on that device is not directly, it's not personal information that's there. It's only work stuff, so it doesn't identify the user. And we try also to make the difference between the user and the device. They're not the same entities, right? And then of course, who are they that are looking at these MAC addresses and we may want to protect from? And of course, there are some network functional entities, and that's where 802.11bh comes in, and maybe we come in as well, where we say some devices in the infrastructure use the MAC address just to know where to send stuff back and to know which service is given by which entity to what other entity. So those are functional entities, and of course, changing the MAC may have some issues, and there are also some human-related entities, and that's where probably many times we talk about things where you may have over-the-air observers on the wired inside a network. That's the OTWI, or outside of the network, EWE, but also some entities managing network, like wireless network operators or network access providers. So we try to list all these possible actors, and I see in the chat, yeah, IPv6, DHCP. Of course, we're not defining functions here. We're listing the functions where we have entities that have an action or an interest in the MAC address. Then, of course, moving away from who is they, that's one thing that can be useful. We also try to look at where the MAC address is a problem and where it is not. And to do that, we need to define two elements. One is what we call the trust. Can you trust everybody? For example, are there environments where and I'll ask the question again at the end of this presentation, are there environments where you can show your MAC address without the fear that the other actors seeing your MAC address are going to be using that MAC address against you, or to track you, or to spy on you? So that would be an environment where you have a full trust. On the other side of a spectrum, of course, you may have zero trust, a place where you say, I don't trust anybody here. And that could be a public place or something like that. And there may be in the middle some gray area that we'll probably need to work on, which is the selective trust, where we say, well, I may need to trust, I don't know, the MAC address, the access point, for example, because I need that thing to make me connect to the internet without billing me every 24 hours every time I change my Mac, but I don't trust something behind. So there may be some areas where selective trust may be set. So defining which level of trust we're seeing for each environment is, I think, important. And of course, defining those environments, where are we looking at for the MAC address problem, is important, because the requirements and the exposure might be different. If you are in your home, the exposure is probably different than if you are in a busy airport or in a coffee shop. If you are in a managed residential setting, for example, these places where there is an IT system for, extended living, for example, where there is an IT system that manages the Wi-Fi, they may have, view on the need to understand what MAC address you had that is different than if you are an enterprise network, for example. And in enterprise, are you bringing your own device? It's your personal device that you also use for work, or is it an enterprise asset? They give you a laptop and it's their laptop, you just happen to use it. So these environments have different assumptions in terms of not only privacy, but of course, the relation of knowing who is doing what. So we try to list those to try to understand, when we discuss which area are we talking about, which trust level do we think it matches, so that we understand what is the effect of RCM. And then in the end, we try to list the requirements that we think are a consequence of the usage of RCM for the Adinas group. And here, I'm not going to read all these together, because it's going to be a little bit boring, but you can read the draft yourself. And we try to list the possible steps that we could take from that assumption in the Adinas group to try to see where services are affected and what recommendations we can make. One thing I would like to add here, which is not today in the draft, and I'll come back on the next two slides also on things which are not in the draft, is that IoT is something we were not observing, looking at in the draft. And from a conversation we had earlier today here, but also some feedback we have on the list, it seems that IoT might be an interesting case to look into. Either as a Michael was referring to a strong identification in enterprise, but also, what is the effect of IoT changing their MAC if it's your IoT at home? So that may be something we may want to envision as well. So we are today at version 3, and I would say that since we posted version 3 of the draft, we and the preparation for this meeting, we received a ton of feedback. So I'd like to thank everybody who took the time and care to read this document and provide feedback. We'll of course we'll respond to it. But in those comments, I think there were two things that I think would be worth bringing to the attention of this group, maybe to discuss today and have your view on this. One is full trust, this environment about full trust I was discussing before. So remember, that's the environment in the draft. We define it as the place where you are not concerned as a user that the MAC of your personal device, your smartphone, for example, would be seen by others. There's no threat to you if others see, your MAC address, and others could be services around, DHCP and the others, whatever, but also users in range of you, looking at your MAC. And being a naive guy living in the US, where my closest neighbor is about a mile and a half away, I say, well, probably a home would be a typical example there, because I don't really care if my dog sees my MAC address, even my wife or my kids. I don't think they are going to attack me. And all the services where the MAC address is seen to me is going to be in my house, because it's going to be my DHCP server, it's going to be my Wi-Fi, etc. So I tend to see that as being an environment where full trust is possible. In the early conversation of this draft, we had some comments saying, yeah, but what if you suddenly turn into an Airbnb? And of course we said, well, then in that case, it's not really a home environment. You just turn your home into hospitality. So it's not really a home environment anymore. But then, we had more and more feedback saying, yeah, but, it's because you, American, live with that middle of nowhere. But if you are an apartment building, your neighbors hear your MAC because you hear their MAC, and they, everybody hears each other. So, the more we get this feedback, the more I began to doubt whether, residential would be a good application for full trust scenario. And that brings a question to this group, and I have another one on the next slide. So I'd like maybe to take 5 minutes here and 5 on the other. Do you think that home, if we qualify it, supposing that you don't have neighbors around sneaking on you behind your wall, could be a full trust environment? And if not, do you think of any place that could be a full trust environment where you would not be afraid of showing your MAC address because you don't think that there would be a threat to your privacy in that environment? Let me pause there to gather some thoughts on this question.
Michael, please go ahead.
Hi, I can't see, even if you have a home on top of a mountain and you don't do Airbnb, I don't see that you want to reveal your MAC addresses of your devices to the service people that will drive up your driveway, may or may not be legitimately. The place where I think that maybe you could have a full trust environment is actually in an enterprise. Where all the devices, the enterprise wants to know that all the devices belong to the enterprise, and if there's anyone else that comes along with something else, they're going to flag it, and maybe there's going to be security detail that goes to remove the device from the thing. So I actually think that the home is almost never ever going to be a full trust environment.
Thank you. That's very useful. Yeah, I like the idea of enterprise. If it's an enterprise asset, yes, of course. Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Joy.
Thank you. Yeah, I pretty much agree with what Michael said. I also think that home environments cannot be fully trusted, not only because there could be diverse attackers or people trying to listen into your home network, but precisely like he said, also because there absolutely is a lack of security mechanisms, right? Especially if we're talking about well, regular homes that don't really have like I don't know, like knowledge or resources to put like secure mechanisms at their home. I also agree that in this scenario, enterprises could be seen as much more secure than home devices. And in home devices, I would even like to mention like my phone. And if I trusted both my phone and my laptop that are used in my home network, I would not be interested in things such as encryption of the DNS, for example, because I should be trusting that network, and I don't. That's it. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. I see it more and more. Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. So we will correct that section of the draft and suggest a different view. Anyone else in the queue before I move to the next one?
Yes, we have 2 people, and then we move.
All right. Yeah, please go ahead. I don't see the queue, so please go ahead.
Hi, Matthew speaking. Thanks for inviting us to comment on that. So my first remark is I don't think we can trust any place in the world where you will have other devices. I already mentioned that in the mailing list, but we are seeing a trend where any kind of device you have in your pocket, especially the smartphones, they are running all kind of applications, which are often including features that are scanning nearby devices, whether they are Bluetooth Low Energy, Wi-Fi, and some companies are already interested in collecting all those identifiers to track and profile you. And this is only for, the commercial entities trying to do some marketing profiling, but I'm sure there are many other scenarios here. And so my point is, as long as you have all the devices, that you, even the one you are controlling, you cannot really trust the environments. And finally, I think, do we really need a specific scenario where full trust is required? What would be the benefits of that, of having this specific case? Can't we apply the rules that we have in non-fully trusted scenario to this one, just in case there is an eavesdropper in range, whether it's someone outside your house or just your smartphone listening on your other devices?
Yeah, thank you, Mathieu. And it's interesting because I agree. So going backwards in your statement, I don't know if there is a place that is a full trust environment, and maybe the conclusion is that full trust environments, these places don't exist, and that's fine. And from what I heard from the 2 previous commenters, Joey and Michael, is that the enterprise environment is such because it's controlled environment, but also because they provide you their devices. So the PII exposure here is close to none because it's an enterprise asset. But also I do see that in an enterprise there could be physical security where you cannot just stick on the wall and sneak inside, etc. But yeah, I see your point. Maybe there is no full trust environment at all. It's good to define that environment and just say, well, on this planet, sorry guys, there is no such place.
Okay, thanks. Next in line is Bob.
The notion that enterprises are very secure and all the same is just wrong. There's a whole range of enterprises, very big to very small, some very open, some very closed. You can't make these general characterizations. And the other thing I would note is that the only way an enterprise or anywhere can validate who's connected to it is actually to do a real challenge where the user has to identify themselves. You can't do this at the device level. Many enterprises allow people to bring their phone and connect to the local network. And they do it by challenging it and causing the person to use their credentials to log in. You can't do this just at the network layer. With MAC addresses or whatever. That may have been a convenient way to track people before, but as we know, no longer. And there's just not a simple solution here that you can do at layer 2 anymore. And you just can't say enterprises are secure and trustworthy, because they're not. And we've all read the reports about ransomware taking down very large enterprises. So the world is much more messy. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And this is one of the big reasons why we have this draft. When we say there are enterprises where there may be full trust, we're not saying all enterprises have full trust because everything is fine everywhere. And I think it's critical to define where this would be set, if it would be set. And I fully agree with your statement. Here, we're looking at RCM, right? So we're saying exposing the MAC address, does that have consequence in terms of PII in those environments? And of course, if the enterprise asset is the enterprise's, not yours, and there is no PII there, well, you don't really care about exposing your MAC because there is nothing of you on this device. But yeah, I also fully agree with your point on the authentication being changed. All right, thank you very much. Thank you for this input. Another one I'd like to bring, if that's okay, Juan Carlos, do I have four more minutes?
Yes, sure. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Is what I call the race conditions. So, going back into this 802.11aq in 2018, I'm making a shortcut saying it forbids changing the MAC during association. It's not entirely true. What it says is that the non-AP stake connecting to an infrastructure BSS shall retain a single MAC address for the duration of its connection across an ESS. To make it simple, BSS is one access point. ESS is when you move from one access point to the other. And the context of that is to say, if you change your MAC, well, you break state, and therefore you have to restart. Okay, so that's the context where we operate, where we say, well, once you're connecting to an access point, if you want to be the same device on that access point, you must keep your MAC address, because if you change it, you're not the same device anymore, and we start from scratch. So that's where we were in 2018. Since then, there has been a lot of questions coming both in 802.11bh and in 802.11bi, where some authors have come and said, well, I may want to go out to lunch, come back and reassociate, which is, regain a state while still changing my MAC address. Or, for privacy reasons, if I'm in a public environment, I may want to have a secure connection to the access point within which secure tunnel I can maybe give an identifier, but for the rest of the world, the observers, I'm going to change my MAC every few minutes. Who knows? So from the outside world, my MAC is changing, but the AP still knows it's me somehow. So knowing that these conversations are happening, in the draft, we do not make any assumption in the fact that your MAC address has to stay stable as long as you're connected to an access point. We don't mention this requirement anywhere. And we had a couple of feedback saying, dude, you don't know, you're not aware of 802.11aq because, you cannot change your MAC there. So, you are leaving open the door to a problem that doesn't exist. And, of course, every single time to every single contributor, we responded, well, it turns out we are aware of it, but we don't know if that's going to hold true for the upcoming years. And we don't make any provision there because it's not our problem in Adinas. It's an 802.11 problem. So we don't define whether the rotation happens within a connection or not. But because we come back to these comments, I wanted to bring the question to the group and ask, do you think that leaving this door open as we do, knowing that things are not necessarily carved in stone, is okay? Or do you think that we should say, well, hold your horses, you're writing here in 2021 November, don't be specific about what happens is allowed in 2021 November, and if things change in 3 months, then you'll change your draft. So what do you think is the right direction? Keeping the door open as we do today, say not specify here because that's not Adina's job, or should we be specific about what is today available and and to change the draft or revise it if things change?
Thanks. Let's go with Dan first. Dan,
can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. So yes, AQ assumes that you've got a single MAC address that you return to when you connect back to the ESS, but that's, I think, going to be addressed in BI when the PMK ID privacy has been addressed, because that will allow a stay to reuse a PMK ID, identify secure state on the AP using a random MAC address. So from the point of view of what Madness should do, I would say nothing. We should just let BI continue doing what BI has said they're going to be doing.
Thank you, Dan. So if I hear you correctly, you're saying we should not be specifying any known or expected projected behavior, right? We just leave things to the group that deals with it and not, make any assumption about what should or should not happen, right?
Yes, that's my suggestion, but
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
one idea. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I put myself in the queue. I think I agree. I think that this is the realm of 802.11, and BI specifically is going to talk about this PMK ID. But I guess my take would be that probably for the document, when you mentioned the draft Zuniga, from the informational point of view, I think it doesn't hurt to say there are this type of conversations in like next steps or follow-up section of the draft, just so that we remind people that it's not written in stone and it's something that it's never going to change, but rather that it's evolving at that point in time. The purpose of the draft being to say what is the current status. I think that if these conversations are taking place, it's fair to at least mention that the conversation is taking place and where.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos.
Thanks.
All right. And that's it for this presentation. So thank you again for everybody, to everybody who took the care to provide feedback. We'll integrate the changes and propose, an updated version of this draft within the next few weeks.
Great. Thank you very much, Jerome. And as expressed in the mailing list by some people, thanks, Michael. The idea is to adopt this draft, and we'll go to that at the end of the meeting, if that's okay. We'll go now to present the other draft that we have, and then we'll do the call for adoption for both drafts at the end. So, Amelia.
Yes, hello. I expect I'm visible. Audible. I was going to ask if either Carlos or Juan, could you display the slides?
Sure.
Thank you.
Let me do it. Sorry. You want to do it, or sorry, or do you want me to project?
Please, go ahead and project. I think it will be easier and reduce the risk of me having software problems. So this is an updated version of a presentation that we already saw in July of this year. So for those of you who were already in the July meeting, a lot of this will look familiar. And it's a quick run through of the draft on MAC address randomization with some updates. So next slide, please. And so the goals of this draft is simply to document the current state of affairs regarding MAC address randomization at the IETF and other SDOs, what's been going on so far. Next slide, please. We have a table of contents with the, that goes over all of the activities that most of them we've already heard about today. So I'm not going to spend so much time reiterating what has already been said during this meeting. I'll just let you reflect upon this table of contents for a while and then ask Carlos to quickly step ahead to slide 9 with OS current practices. Actually, it should be on slide 7 because this is the most recent update. And so what we've done since July is basically map out how mobile operating systems are currently randomizing their MAC addresses. This can be either done by randomizing the MAC address between connections to an SSID, or, and this is the most common, that a MAC address is kept for the same SSID or within the same network. And we've checked whether this happens on, for which platforms this happens and how different implementers are doing that. If you go to the next slide, on slide 8, you can see what capabilities are available in Linux, Android 10, Windows 10, iOS 14 plus. You're invited to review these slides. So fairly descriptive table already. The draft has also been updated to a version 1 to reflect these new investigations. And I think we've also addressed some comments from Jerome Henry. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. If you have any further comments and reviews, please share them with me or Juan Carlos or Carlos. Thank you.
Carlos?
Yes, here as a author of this draft, not as a chair here. So just to complement what Amelia said, regarding the changes, we made some editorial changes to basically match or better adapt to the Madinas Charter that is now approved. We also changed the name of the draft, so it's now draft Zuniga Madinas. Although well, that the other name was also representative enough, but just to follow the typical practices. And then regarding the mobile OSS changes, let me go back just to that slide. We added this, which basically the idea is to document, and this is related to the discussion that we had just had with Jerome on what the OSS are doing today. So this is an attempt of kind of characterize what they are doing. Of course, these things are very much alive, and the practices are changing. But this was an attempt of basically see what they are doing in terms of if the address is stable or persistent per network, per connection, if it changes daily or not, if it depends or allows to do a configuration different per SSID or not, and also at looking at how they behave in terms of the MAC addresses that they use when they are doing a scanning, not yet associated to any specific network. We already got some comments from Jerome on things like the table and some corrections. So please, we would like to get as much feedback as possible, not only in the actual content that maybe there are some mistakes. We try to be as rigorous as possible, but of course there may be some errors, but also in the way we could keep that documentation, because since things may change, we may want to reflect in the document a bit the evolution, not only the current state, the current picture as the moment of the document is released. Well, that was just it, just to complement what Amelia said. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Carlos. Indeed, I think, again, the document being informational, it provides a good snapshot, but also a historic of how things are evolving. And as we can see clearly, the lack of consistency in the behavior of different implementations, it's also something that we need to be aware of. Great, so thank you very much, Amelia. I guess we can move now to the, yes, thanks. The last part. And the idea now is to adopt these two drafts. So let's start with the draft Henry Madinas Framework 03, the one presented by Jerome previously. Again, this document has been discussed at length on the mailing list. So the idea is to adopt it as working group item. And for that, we want to just ask here if there are any questions or comments regarding adopting this draft. Of course, we will be confirmed on the mailing list, but first, let me ask the group, are there any comments or anyone speaking in favor or against adopting this draft? No comments? We did see some proposals on the mailing list to get it adopted, but yes, Rich.
So my only concern, and we can address that somehow, is the informational slides about, well, this is what Android 10 does or what Windows 95 did. That stuff tends to get out of date. It also means we have to be very careful about surveying a large part of the community, like why Android and not Safari or Chromebooks or iOS. So I'm just worried about that issue, which I think the working group can address, because once it's published as an RFC, then it's in stone forever, and people will not notice that the information is now 2 years out of date. Just a concern, not arguing against adoption.
Thanks. Right now we're on draft Henry, which is the previous draft. I guess you're referring to the second draft, but the point is well taken. So we will address that when we move to the next draft. Sorry about the confusion. Bob?
And that is these tables, which you don't want them to be locked down in an RFC. We now have GitHub, and GitHub can be tied to the work group and the rest of it. You can reference the GitHub in the document, point to where it is, and then maintain these tables as a living thing instead of just a static in the RFC. Consider doing that.
Thanks, Bob. That was an answer to Rich's comment, valid, but also addressing the other draft, not the one that is being displayed right now. Sorry about the confusion. Maybe we should have made the call for adoption right after the draft Henry. But again, we'll go back to that point about the table on the second draft. Now moving back again to the first draft. Draft Henry Adinas, the one presented before by Jerome. If there are one last call for comments, otherwise I guess we can move to the mailing list, the call for adoption. All right. So if there are no more comments on draft Henry Adinas, we'll call for adoption on the mailing list, and we'll see if we can get it adopted there. Next slide, please. So this is the second call for adoption and for draft Swing and Adinas. And this is the one that we've already got 2 comments regarding the table showing the discrepancy between behaviors in operating systems when it comes to MAC address randomization. Being a co-author of this draft, I will move myself away from the mic, and I will let Mathieu Conche run this call for adoption. Mathieu, do you want to open your mic, please?
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to handle that from now. Joey, you're the next in line.
Actually, I was trying to get it active for the previous draft. I'm sorry.
All right.
For the delay, so sorry. I just wanted to say that I would support adoption of the Henry Adinas draft, just after making the changes specifically about the trust and how to set the levels of trust. And yeah, that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
Michael?
So I will echo what Bob said about the tables and things like this, but I think that actually the useful thing that this document could do, rather like I think one of the early Behave documents for NAT, is to just give names to the different policies that we have seen over time. Not say who did them at one point in this document, but rather to say these are the policies that we've seen. That way we can talk intelligently about, things, even if we just call them type 1 and type 2 and type 7 or something like that. At least we could have a better conversation about, if the device is in it does type 1 policy, then you expect this kind of thing to happen. And the table later on could tell us what versions of what OSs did what things in the past.
Dave?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to say very similar things to what Michael said. I guess as a past Behave working group chair, that's probably not surprising. I think I have no personal opinion as to whether there is a snapshot of a table in the document or only on GitHub, right? I'm fine either way with that one. But I think the main value that can be provided, as Michael said, is if you look at the table, the definition of the rows, right, is kind of similar to what Michael was saying, right? You can define a set of the types of behaviors that you've seen out there, regardless of exactly which operating systems and stuff they map to, or which versions of which operating systems. If you can define the taxonomy by which the GitHub or whatever the table is, whether it's in the document or in GitHub, if you can define the taxonomy of what the behaviors are that you've seen so far, I think that in and of itself is valuable to adopt in the working group. So thanks.
Any other comment, questions? All right. If there is no other questions, I suggest we continue the discussion to the mailing list, and there will be a call for adoption on the mailing list.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew, and thanks everyone for those comments. Very valid, very good points as an author. Now, going back to the meeting, well, this is, we're arriving to the end of the agenda, so we're going to ask any last question or comment anyone would like to make. Eric?
Yes. Sorry for wearing a mask. I'm basically in my dad's home and there's a technician nearby, so I apologize for the noise. It was unexpected. Anyway, I would love, let's say, for the first meeting, seeing about 60 to 70 participants in the meeting with many interaction on the chat is really a proof that this working group needed to exist. Just to clarify, I would also like to thank teams for WBA and Glenn and IEEE for presenting their SDO point of view. It's always interesting when multiple SDO works. And now, removing my AD hat, just participants of this working group, I would really love to get this call for adoption done. And like many others, I don't care what is GitHub or an RFC. There are many RFC that say it's a snapshot, dated, of course, in 2021, 2022, or whatever. So let's continue the job. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Eric. And thanks everyone for participating and all your comments. So we look forward to seeing your interactions on the mailing list. Thanks everyone, and have a good end of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.